Ecosystem services, one of my favorite topics. I absolutely love this topic. And one of you is using ecosystem services in your research. Where is that person? Just walked in. Okay. So, how many of you are familiar with the ecosystem services topic? How many of you have read any paper, any write-up, anything about ecosystem services? Once you settle down, tell us, what do you understand about ecosystem services? This is what happens when you come late, you know, you're asked a question. Excellent. So there are a few keywords, right? Services provided by ecosystems to benefit humans. So humans is the keyword here. The ecosystem services are looked at purely from humans' benefit point of view. What are the benefits that we are deriving from the ecosystems where we live in? When I was a student, at that time, there was a word commonly used, natural resource exploitation, and it's not used anymore because it's not sustainable. We cannot exploit ecosystems. When you do that, it means that the resources are finite, and we won't leave those resources for next generations or next 100 years. And so collectively, as a society, we moved away from that term. And sustainability is the key. Similarly, now the discussion and dialogue has evolved to what are the services that ecosystems are providing to us for our own benefit. And that's what we will be looking today. So, learning objectives at the end of this class, I would expect you to understand the various types and roles of ecosystem services. And this is very important because if you read the literature, I can guarantee you at least half of you will be confused at the end, you know, what is ecosystem services versus what is ecosystem function versus something else. And early literature was not unanimous on this concept. Then you should be able to quantify different types of ecosystem services using SWOT model, and you should be able to understand the concept of food, energy, water nexus. Right? So, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that came out in 2005 came up with the definition of ecosystem services. It is the benefits that humans, we, us, receive from our environment. And Fisher in 2009 talked about aspects of ecosystems that are utilized both actively and passively to produce human well-being. Our own health, our own well-being is tightly interlinked with the services we receive from our ecosystems. And if those services are not there, we see the impact, negative impact on our own well-being. These are essential for food security, water availability, and climate regulation. And these are interconnected. Our human health and ecological system is absolutely critical for sustainability. Right, so here is a conceptual diagram where you are looking at the movement of water and then how that supports agriculture and how that then affects the water quality and how that affects erosion and how everything is interlinked. So there are, broadly speaking, 4 categories of ecosystem services that our environments provide: provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services. Provisioning services are what we directly get to sustain ourselves, right? So food, fresh water, wood and fiber, and fuel. Those are the broad categories of provisioning ecosystem services. Then regulating, how ecosystem is regulating various functions, such as climate regulation. If you live in a highly urbanized area, then you are living in a heat island, right? And temperature there is higher than surrounding areas. But if you plant trees and if you have green space, then suddenly that ecosystem is regulating climate, and that heat island is not severe anymore, or that severe anymore. So that is the regulating service. Flood regulation, right? So again, I was talking on a sideline with someone yesterday or day before yesterday who was talking about flooding in Bangalore, and how some of the areas are developed without any regard to the drainage. And when that happens, when it rains, of course the area will flood. What happens if you take out the wetlands and convert that into a residential area? Then ecosystem's ability to regulate the flood or flooding will go away, right? And so these are important regulating services: flood regulation, disease regulation. Give me an example. Speak up. Okay. Tell me a little more. Mm-hmm.
So we cut down the connections much.
Yeah.
And then we are supporting to reveal who is already condemned, providing them proper medicine and research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
By establishing camps, this kind of management services.
Yeah. Yeah. So another example is mosquito breeding grounds in wetlands, right? And so wetlands are providing, we talked about the flood regulation. But when mosquitoes lay eggs in wetlands, and then wetlands are inhabited by fish, the fish will eat those eggs, and the breeding of mosquitoes will be regulated, which in turn will directly impact human health. And if you take that out, then nature's ability to regulate that diminishes. Water purification. Of course, we talked about intrinsic ability for every river and stream to purify itself. And if we alter that a lot, whether we are altering the channel itself or whether we are altering the surrounding land use, the ability to purify itself will go down. If you are living in a healthy ecosystem, all these things will be regulated in an ideal way. You will have the clean air, you will have less severe temperature fluctuations, you will be protected from flooding, or at least the extremes of the flooding. There will be less diseases, and we will be healthier, and then water will be pure. And then cultural, which is a bit more difficult to quantify but equally important, where you're looking at the aesthetics value. This campus is beautiful because of the trees and because of the grasses that are there, as opposed to if it was all just parking lot and concrete. Just walking into the campus, you get a good feeling, right? And because of this aesthetic ecosystem that it is providing to us. Spiritual, educational and recreational. There are plenty of literature suggesting why green spaces are needed. To many people, it's very spiritual. You go to those green spaces and you feel uplifted. Some of the areas near where you guys are in Roorkee, I visited those places. And I mean, it's absolutely uplifting. Whether you are religious or not, being religious and being spiritual are two very different things. I'm not a religious person, but I'm a very spiritual person. And spiritually, going to some of those places, it was amazing. And it was amazing because the service ecosystem is providing to us. So then, looking at the linkages, and the size of the arrow determines how important it is. Bigger is the arrow, more important it is. And then the color, whether that linkage is low or medium or high. So look at, for example, provisioning services and the security, personal security, securing resource access, security from diseases. That connection is there, but the connection is even stronger when you look at the basic materials that are needed to have a good life, such as adequate livelihoods, sufficient nutritious food, shelter, access to goods that you need. And that linkage becomes weaker when you are looking at the provisioning services and social cohesion, mutual respect, or ability to help others. So these are all interlinked. The level of link, the strength of linkage to our well-being may vary from one service to other service, but these are all interlinked services. And so we talked about it, provisioning services. These are the food and fiber and fuel, as well as genetic resources that we derive, biochemicals and pharmaceuticals, ornamental resources, and fresh water. These are all things that nature is providing to us for our well-being. Then regulating services, air quality regulation, right? Forested areas will have better air quality than completely built up areas. Climate regulation, we talked about heat island effect, water regulation, and how forested catchments are able to provide better quality of water. They regulate erosion, and there is less erosion happening from those areas. Water purification and waste treatment, disease regulation, pest regulation, pollination, and natural hazard regulation. So these are all regulating services that are happening for our benefits in a healthy ecosystem. And then the cultural services, we talked about cultural diversity, spiritual and religious values, knowledge systems, educational values, recreational, so on and so forth. Supporting services. So these are not within themselves ecosystem services, but these are the functions that support three other services, right? Such as soil formation. A healthy area would be forming the soil at the rate erosion takes place. Erosion is always happening. You cannot stop that. but question is it at a sustainable rate? And one way to look at it is the soil formation that is happening is at least at the same rate as the rate of erosion. And if that is the case, then you will maintain the health of the soil, right? But if erosion is faster than soil formation, then you are going to lose soil, and you are going to lose the top layer of the soil, which is typically most fertile and most productive. Photosynthesis. So another function, right? And photosynthesis is directly related to food and fuel and fiber provisioning. Primary production because of the photosynthesis, and in case of trees and or crops, and for other microbes and animals, the amount of biomass that gets accumulated because of the primary productivity. Nutrient cycling we talked about, and water cycling that we talked about yesterday. So here is a real ecosystem that I have studied, and if you are standing here, right, in the stream from where the picture was taken, and you look at this as an ecosystem, and you look at it from the ecosystem services point of view, you will start to see the services this is providing. This was a stream in Arkansas when I was a faculty member there, and we had done some nutrient dynamics studies and nutrient injection studies that formed the basis of my talk yesterday. And right around that time, this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment report came out. And I read that report, and next time we went to do those experiments, I stood there and took the picture, thinking about ecosystem services that we were deriving. And this is what I could see at that time. I see this picture differently now, but I did not change the slide. That was made in 2006. This is what I could see at that time. I could see the biodiversity from different plants and shrubs and trees that were there. We measured nutrient cycling, so I know it is happening because we have quantified it and we have published it. I saw the water regulation, and I saw the floodplain and how the floodplain was interacting with the main channel, and how that floodplain was protecting the areas away from it. It was a very healthy stream, very, very healthy stream. It's a first order stream. And there was hardly any significant erosion or sedimentation happening in the stream. And I could see that, how beautifully it was regulating erosion. And of course, refugia, the bird species that would come and nest there and would find home was important for the cultural and spiritual services. Someone could come and sit there for hours and watch those birds and improve the quality of life in doing so. Right? So next time you go into an area and look at the area, or you are inspired to take a picture, you take out your smartphone and take a picture. Think about ecosystem services that you see there, and can you see those services? I can see that. That's once you start seeing, and once you start visualizing, it's hard to unsee that. And start doing that, right? And start thinking about ecosystem services that are not there, that could be there, and what needs to be done to bring those services back. So these services are also constantly impacted by what we do in the landscape. These are benefiting us. At the same time, we are impacting these ecosystem services. And so land use and land management plays a big role in what happens to the ecosystem services. Climate change is impacting ecosystem services in an unprecedented way. Amount of water that we use for different purposes, whether it is agriculture, industrial, home use, you name it, as well as the biomass removal, removing trees, removing shrubs, clearing the floodplains, impacts the ecosystem's ability to regulate not only flooding but regulate erosion, right? And so these are the things that we are actively and intentionally doing to impact the ecosystem services, oftentimes impacting those services in a negative way, right? So biting the hands that feed us. Some of that is needed, but if you start thinking from what needs to be done to maintain those ecosystem services, you will be more conscientious in the decisions that you make. So there are three important terms that I want you to understand, because as you read literature, this is confusing. And it's important for you to understand the difference among these three terms. Ecosystem functions. In some of the early literature, ecosystem functions are described as ecosystem services, but they are not. These are the structures and processes that contribute to ecosystem services, but they themselves are not ecosystem services. So amount of nutrients or nutrient load or concentration in a stream is a function. It's not ecosystem service. It's providing the regulating services or provisioning services, either the water provision or water regulation. But amount of nitrogen in the water itself is not an ecosystem service, right? So I want you to understand the difference. Then other one, much of the early literature and even the literature on the ecosystem services is dominated by the values of the ecosystem services. If you remove the trees from the riparian corridor, what is the dollar value or what is the rupee value of the ecosystem service that is lost? So that is the valuation of ecosystem services. How do you put monetary value? And what we were discussing yesterday was valuing the ecosystem services, which is different from quantifying the ecosystem services, right? So getting 10 tons of maize, corn or rice from agricultural production is not same as dollar value of 10 tons of rice. And that's where the two differences are. How do you quantify ecosystem services? Because we can't manage what we can't quantify. You can't regulate what you cannot quantify, right? So if you want to change something, you have to be able to quantify that first. And if you are unable to quantify it, you are not going to be able to change that, right? So it's important to understand how do you quantify ecosystem services. And this is one of the skill sets you will have between only 2 days left for this workshop, but you will have that skill set between today and tomorrow. And then we will not delve into valuing ecosystem services as none of us are economists, but you talk to the economists and they have done a lot of work on valuation of ecosystem services. So here is an example, right? And what you see, another one of the water sets that we have extensively studied, and you are looking at what I call a flower diagram, where we are looking at food provisioning, fresh water provisioning, what is FR, flood regulation, erosion regulation, and fuel provisioning. So select ecosystem services. And this is normalized to be from 0 to 1 or 0 to more than 1 in this case. If the ecosystem is really balanced ecosystem, all of these petals will be equal length, right? And if one is missing and other one is dominating, it means that from ecosystem services point of view, it's a highly altered ecosystem. So what you see here, when we looked at the current state of St. Joseph River watershed, what we saw that it's predominantly row crop agriculture. Vamsi, did you study this watershed? Yeah, so you, lots of corn and soybean. It does an amazing job with the food provisioning. But it happens at the cost of other services. And so therefore, it's providing one service, but it's not a very well balanced ecosystem, if you look at it from overall health of the ecosystem. And so then we looked at what if we just go and take the high slope areas where we are growing corn and soybean right now, and because of that there is a lot of erosion that is happening, and we have taken away the ability to do the erosion regulation and convert those areas into perennial grasses called miscanthus. Miscanthus is elephant grass here in India. And you put that under elephant grass or miscanthus, harvest miscanthus for biofuel production. And so now we have improved the erosion regulation, we have increased the fuel provisioning, and we have improved the health of the watershed or ecosystem by doing that, right? So what you see that suddenly, because miscanthus is put only in high slope areas, not everywhere, because not growing corn or not growing soybean is not an option. Farmers need that income. But let's do that, let's take it out from the problematic areas without having too significant of an economic impact, right? And so by doing that, our food provisioning reduced because you're taking areas out of corn and soybean production. But fuel provisioning increased. Erosion regulation improved. And there was not much difference on the flood regulation. If we keep working on it, it becomes a trade-off. Some of the services will increase, other will decrease. But this will become a very healthy ecosystem. And that's one way to look at how you can utilize ecosystem services to manage your watershed. Make sense? All of you are with me up to this point? I have not lost anyone? Yeah, at least I see that no one is struggling to stay awake, which is a great thing. You probably all didn't eat too much breakfast. So here is an example. This is how a cornfield looks like in the US. And this is how a miscanthus field looks like in the US. You worked on these fields, right? You went there in cold winter mornings and collected some data. And so what you are saying is, in a typical corn soybean, the values I showed here is on the annual basis. We can also look at it at a much smaller, much finer temporal resolution, and what's happening on the monthly time basis. Fraction of erosion that is happening in any given month under the outer area is under corn soybean, and corn/soybean, what it means is that this year it is corn, next year this will be soybean, That's typically how it is done. So it rotates between corn and soybean on a 2-year basis. And what will happen on erosion itself if we took this field and convert that into miscanthus, a bioenergy crop? You see that it will reduce the erosion to almost zero throughout the year. And then what will happen to the nitrate loading that is going? This is a heavily tile drained environment, so the water leaches to the tiles and then tiles discharge into a surrounding ditch that goes to a stream, and then it goes all the way to Wabash River, to Mississippi River, Wabash River to Ohio River, to Mississippi River, to Gulf of Mexico. So there is a direct conduit from here to Gulf of Mexico, and nitrate getting there, creating hypoxia that we talked yesterday. So what happens to the nitrogen? The nitrogen loading, the temporal resolution, how much nitrate is getting into the water every month, and how that will be reduced if we replace that with miscanthus. And then you can take this and convert that into quantifying the ecosystem service and look at ecosystem services not only at an annual scale, but also at a monthly scale. There are different methods available to quantify ecosystem services, and early literature, most of the work that was done in the beginning between 2005 and next 5 to 10 years, land use was predominantly used as a surrogate, as a proxy for ecosystem services. And I want you to understand that land use within itself is a function, it's not an ecosystem service, right? So by looking at certain area under agricultural land is a proxy to food production, but that itself is not food production ecosystem service. So even though the relationship is linear between land use and ecosystem service, it is a proxy, it's not exactly the ecosystem service, because it does not consider the interdependence among different services. And then there are, one of the most widely used models is the INVEST model. This is what I was trying to tell you yesterday. So look it up. It came from Stanford University. And we have published some papers comparing INVEST with the approach that we developed. But it's one of the most widely used methods in quantifying ecosystem services. It's a really good model. Problem is that it's very data intensive, and if it is data intensive for US conditions, you can imagine how it will be for something like India. So what we did, you identify a problem, then you solve the problem, and at least you make an attempt to solve the problem. We developed a method to quantify ecosystem services, and Rebecca Logston, who is the first author on this paper, was my PhD student. Her undergraduate was in agricultural engineering and mathematics. She was a double major. So when she came, I told Becca, you have all the quantitative skills to do this. Let's get on to it. And she did some amazing work, and this is one of those, the work that came out from her master's and PhD research, is a way to quantify ecosystem services, and then she linked that to how we can do that using the SWOT model. And so she looked at these ecosystem services, freshwater provision, food provision, fuel provision, genetic resource, erosion regulation, and flood regulation. And next few slides that I will show you is best on the master's research that she did. So this is how she was mapping it, looking at freshwater provision, which if you look at the functions that support the ecosystem service, when freshwater provision is supported by nutrient cycling and retention, and then what we need to look at, what processes we need to look at from the model output point of view is water quality, such as nitrate, ammonia nitrite, organic nitrogen, mineral phosphorus, organic phosphorus, etc., along with water quantity. Looking at the food and fuel provision, functions that support climate, nutrient cycling and availability, and we need to look at the total biomass and total yield. And these are all given by the SWOT model. When you look at the SWOT outputs, you get this. Erosion regulation, soil formation and soil retention affects it. Total suspended solids and sediment yield can be used to quantify that. And then the flood regulation, where we are looking at hydrology such as infiltration, groundwater storage, and discharge and evapotranspiration, and total stream flow can be used to quantify that. So how she is quantifying? Freshwater provision, right? And idea is that the fresh water is a function of the quantity of water and quality of water. If you have a whole lot of water, but if it's dirty water, the fresh water provisioning is diminished, right? And therefore, you just cannot only look at the stream flow and say that this is how much fresh water provisioning we are getting. You also need to look at the quality of that water. And that's what she is doing here, where she is looking at the mean flow and environmental flow requirement. There was a question yesterday or day before yesterday on the minimum environmental flow. You asked that question. She brought that into ecosystem service quantification. What is the minimum environmental flow that is needed? And then what is the mean flow compared to that, right? So if mean flow is above, then this number will be more than 1. If it is below 1, then this will be a fraction and your freshwater provisioning will be less. Then she is also looking at how many times this flow is above the mean flow, the minimum flow requirement. So, and then she is looking at the water quality index to bring the water quality also into freshwater provisioning. And water quality index is a function of different constituent concentrations. So this could be nitrogen, phosphorus, pesticide, you name it. And anything that is important to you for your watershed, you can look at the water quality parameters. And that as a function of the standard for that parameter, right? So if the, does anyone know pick any constituent and give me a standard for that constituent. Does anyone know what is the drinking water standard for nitrate? No. 45 ppm. So that's the Indian standard. I'm asking because I don't know. I'm not challenging your number. So, but couple of you said 45, so probably it is 45 milligram per liter. In US it is 10. So if you're looking at nitrate, right, and if nitrate concentration is less than 10, then it's good. And because it goes on the denominator, then it improves the water quality index. But if it is more than that, then it's 1, this is a positive number, and then this will go down. Right, so you can look at different constituent concentrations and also at the same time assign a weight to those constituents. So if sediment is the most important constituent and you don't care about nitrogen, phosphorus, pesticide, whatnot, you can assign more weight to sediment and less weight to other. As long as the sum of those weights equals 1, you will be fine. So you guys are with me? Have I transferred my mental knowledge to your mental reservoir? All good? Okay. So this is how C is quantifying the freshwater provisioning. Then looking at the food provisioning, she is looking at the biomass and yield and comparing that with the minimum yield, right? So you may have a watershed or you may have an agricultural field that is so poor in quality that the yield is really less. And you know what an average yield should be. And so therefore, just comparing the yield to an expected average yield, you can have an idea whether it is providing the food at its capacity or not. And you know that the capacity is diminished and something needs to be done, right? So that's what she is trying to do here, where she is looking at the index dividing the food provision quantity by total biomass of food crops that are produced, and looking at different kinds of those food crops, because very rarely it's just one food type that comes out. Fuel provisioning is done exactly the same way, except now this is for fuel, not the food. So miscanthus, for example, for bioenergy as opposed to corn for the food. Or it could be corn for food and fuel both, because if the stem is harvested for bioenergy, then you can use that for fuel provisioning. Erosion regulation, where she is looking at the annual erosion as a function of what is the maximum allowable erosion. And one way to look at the maximum allowable erosion is comparing that with undeveloped sites. So you compare an agricultural watershed to a forested watershed. Erosion is always there, right? Erosion is probably never zero. Even in most pristine, undeveloped watersheds, there will be certain amount of erosion that takes place. And so whether you use that or use that in terms of what would it have been if the watershed was not developed, and use that here as a maximum compared to the annual that is happening right now, you can get this index of erosion that ranges between 0 and 1, and then use that as a quantity of erosion regulation. Flood regulation, looking at the duration of flood events, how many days the stream is flooded, average magnitude of flood events in cubic meters per second, number of flood events per year, how many times it is happening per year, and then these are the long-term or historical values for each of these components, and then you are assigning weights for each of the flooding components, where the sum of the weights is equal to 1. And so she took this method and applied that to the SWOT model and looked at the SWOT outputs, where for freshwater provisioning, she is looking at the stream flow nitrate, total suspended solids, and total phosphorus concentration. So those were the 3 water quality parameters, as well as the water quantity that is coming from stream flow, food provisioning, crop yield, total crop harvested from the basin. Fuel is the same way. Genetic resource, she is looking at the stream flow and nitrate and total suspended solid concentration, as well as the water temperature. An idea is that these are the values that affect. She looked at fish as a genetic resource and how that affects the fish population and fish diversity. And then erosion regulation, where she is looking at sediment yield and stream flow. And this is what she found, that under current condition, how these different ecosystem services the indices look like when she's normalizing it between 0 and 1. And how the food and fuel provisioning is really high, erosion regulation is high, but fresh water and flood regulations are relatively low. And then compare that to if you take that and convert that into all forested, then what will happen? Perhaps the food provisioning will go down to 0, and other services will improve. What will happen if it was all urban areas? And what will happen if it was all areas under corn production or maize production? And so now it starts to give you an idea about different what-if scenarios, and it starts to give you a way to manage your watershed. And same figure, except that now here are the absolute values of each one of these ecosystem services. So, take home points. What I want you to absolutely understand is there are different ecosystem services are important for our own welfare and survival. And when we look at an ecosystem, I want you to start looking at it from ecosystem services point of view, how it is benefiting us, what benefits are we deriving from this ecosystem. And as you walk out, for your lunch, I mean, you can start to see some of the services from this campus that we are getting and start to make those connections. There are different approaches to evaluating ecosystem services, land use as a proxy for ecosystem services. If you don't have anything else, at least you can get an idea just from looking at land use point of view. And then ecosystem services that are derived from the functions of the ecosystems. And then the third approach is valuing those ecosystem services, putting a monetary value, putting a dollar value. In a healthy watershed, these multiple ecosystem services will be present. It won't be dominated by one and others mostly absent or missing. And you can use ecosystem services as an end point of management for developing sustainable solutions. It provides a very powerful end point of management because it gives a different perspective. Questions? So